Hello everyone, happy Thursday. As normal, unfortunately, as you know, we shifted today by about an hour. So for those of you that are missing it because we're an hour early, sorry about that, but hopefully you can catch up later. So we're going to spend the next hour as normal. We'll edit in Capture One, and we'll go through what we do with your pictures, and we'll see how well we can make them look. So. Before we get started, today is a well, for those of you in the future watching back, this might look rather amusing, but today, for those of you watching live, is a very specific day for Mac users. It's called Don't Be Stupid Day. So today, Big Sur is released by Apple. It's been beated for quite a long time, but now it's the release day. The reason it's Don't Be Stupid Day is, please, if you're on a production system, in other words, a system that you rely on for your work or for your images or whatever, please don't install this straight away. It doesn't mean that Capture One doesn't support it. It doesn't mean that there isn't one random person that you've heard of that managed to get it working on a beta and whatever. It's simply the fact that it will not be supported if you have any problems until you're on the right version. So Capture One haven't yet released the official Big Sur compatible version of version 20. So on that basis, just please go careful. By all means, if you've got a Play system, then go for it, and you know all the risks associated with that. But it's the first cut of that operating system. For those of you that remember what happened with Catalina, a lot of people got a nasty surprise when stuff stopped working. So just be careful with that. So let's have a look at what we're going to go through today in Capture One. So we're on version 13.1.3 at the moment. You find that out by going to either Help About or Capture One About, depending on your operating system. And that will tell you either 13.1.3, or if you bought it, you'll see online in your Capture One account 20.1.3. So as of today, we're running 13.1.3 on OS, well, I'm running OS X Catalina. In the future, that'll obviously change up to Big Sur and up to a slightly different version that's more compatible with Big Sur. Okay, so please make sure you're on the latest version or the latest stable version. That'll mean that you can follow along with any of these edits. If you don't have Capture One, then just go to capture1.com and download the free trial. No problem. You get to use it for 30 days with no restrictions, so all good. So that said, let's just remember it's Don't Be Stupid Day, please, because this happens every single time. What happens is all the forums fill up with people saying, I've installed Big Sur and this doesn't work and that doesn't work. Or last year it was Catalina. And unfortunately all the software guys just turn around and say, well, you need to wait. So with waiting in mind, let's have a look at our first image. This is one that Barry sent in. Really nice image. Today we're also going to go through something about focus stacking. Sorry, a bit of a mind blank there. So we're going to go through the Helicon Focus loop again, the round trip for Helicon Focus. So we did this very, very, very early on in one of the first live sessions that we did. But a few people have been asking about focus stacking again. So let's have a little play with it again today. And I'll show you how we do the round trip and how you actually place all the images together. But first, this is a single shot from Barry. So here is the raw. Rather handily, Barry sent me the EIP. So the EIP is the file that includes all of the adjustments that you've made as well as the raw. So we can look at the layers and everything that you've created, just like here. So we can see that Barry's done a brightening of the center. There's a foreground layer, which is this part here. There's a sky layer. And the question that Barry sent with it was, he's made some adjustments to the foreground in the color balance tool. And in that way, it's made it more orange and more yellow, and you can see that against the raw. And also, if I have a look at the sky tool, we've got a bit of a boost. It's not coming from color balance, but maybe it's coming from this slight change, in the white balance here. So if I look at the raw and compare it to the final image, we can see there's quite a lot that's shifted, and I can see why. So to my mind, there's nothing wrong with the shift that's happened. It's as in to make it more orange or more yellow. It looks more autumnal, more sort of ready for harvest than the original rather flat version of the image did. But there's a bit of a color cast on it, and that's what Barry's picked up. So if I look at here, clouds shouldn't really be that sort of slightly muddy color. It doesn't make sense. They can be warm, they can be pink, they can be reflecting all the light from a sunset or golden hour. But to see a cloud that's slightly brown or that sort of murky, greeny, yellowy sort of color just feels a bit wrong. And some of that's coming from the color shift. We've also got a bit of a challenge out here. So if you look on the left here in the image, oh, someone just asked, actually, just before we came on, someone asked about the how do I zoom into an area very quickly. So, quick guide. In Capture One, this is our main window here, our viewer. So we've got our browser here on the right and the viewer here. If I want to choose which ones to show, I can turn off the viewer if I want and just have a library of images. Or I can just have the or turn off the browser on the right and then just focus on one image if I want. But in the viewer, if I'm clicked up here with the hand allows me to double click to 100% and double click back out to fit wherever I am. So if I click over here, double click and double click back out. If I choose the zoom button on the magnifier or press the Z button on my keyboard, and then anywhere in the image, if I just draw a little marquee or a box around the area, it'll fill the screen with the area that I draw the box in. And I can use the scroller on the mouse to zoom out or to zoom in. So in, scroll up, out, scroll down. So if I want to look at this in detail, we just draw a little box over it. Now, if I look at this as a before and after, so up here we've got our before and after tool, and I've got my little windscreen wiper. This here has become overexposed. So we had actually some detail in here in the cloud, but the result of making this sort of punch of contrast has really overblown that highlight here in the sky. So if I turn this layer off, it's still over. If I turn this bright and center off, it's still over. So it's actually on the background layer that this is happening. And my gut feel is, even though, well, something weird is going on, because even though there isn't a change in the levels, something is forcing this to get really, really, really bright. I do wonder whether maybe it's the sky, and it could actually be this level here. Yeah, it is. It's there. So let me just show you. We've got our sky masked here, and what Barry's done is, to make this punch a little bit more, is drag the histogram here to basically map those levels. So what we say is black, fine. Mid-gray, well, it's going to be adjusted in proportion. But here, anything that was 232, so remember, in everything we do, we were on a scale from 0 to 255. So everything that we do on that scale relates to our histogram. So everything here is 0, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Midpoint is 128, all the way up to 255. Now, 255 being completely white, so maximum of red, green, and blue if you're talking about Luma. And at 255, we've got no more detail. That's it. So what we've done here in this mapping is it's gone from 232 up to 255. In other words, if something was 255 before, it's now going to be completely overblown. If it was 232, it's now going to be 255. So we're stretching the histogram. We're making the stuff that was at 232 brighter up to 255. If it was 231, that might map to 254 now. 230 might map to 253, and so on. So effectively, we're deleting, or we're chopping out this triangle to the right of this little line. So the result of that is you get a picture that looks a little more contrasty. So we can see that the sky has gone pop. Great. But we're also losing stuff that was already bright. So if I turn this back to where it was, so let's just reset our levels tool and use my mouse cursor. So look at these numbers at the top here. As I move my cursor along the image into this area, we're already at 252, 247, 222. The average of those being 246. That's our Luma amount. So here's the problem. If I use my levels tool to pull the histogram down below effectively 246, let's say in this case, so that average, the Luma one, if I do that, anything between 232 and 246, or 232 and above, is lost. It becomes 255. So in my head, the most we want to pull this down ever is going to be about 246. And if I do that up here, we can see these numbers are now, look, 252, 253, around that. One of them, where are we? 253, 253, 226, and so on. We're getting really close to that point that we're losing all the detail. So while the levels tool can be really powerful for adding in contrast, be really careful that you don't push that levels tool too far, because you're going to push some of the detail out. Now on top of that, we've also got our white slider here, and that allows us, on top of the levels tool, to then pull back even more detail in the white. So if I just zoom in here, and let's just put that back to here, so that's where we were. By pulling that down, you see it's a very subtle change, but it's pulled down the detail in the very, very highly exposed areas, so white on the scale, a little bit more. So we've got a little bit more detail back. So to me, that then recovers that enough. I would actually be tempted to go even further, to be honest, because it doesn't quite sit that this bit here is so bright, whereas the rest of the shot isn't quite there. Now, one other way we could do that, if I added a new layer, I'm going to call it left darken. Really simple layer. I'm going to click on this one, which is our radial gradient, and I'm just going to draw. Let me just turn my before and after off. I'm just going to draw a very soft gradient here. And with that gradient, I'm just going to pull the exposure down just a bit. So now we've sort of evened up the image, so it's a bit more level in terms of the lighting elements of it. So where are we? David's just said, when I use the scroll ring on my trackball, the image size goes between fit and 400%. Is there any way to have an intermediate size? It might just be the sensitivity on your scroller, David. So I have to set my scroller really, really low. So as I'm moving my mouse now, you can see it's going in steps. So I go from fit to 50, 67, 100, 200, 300, 400. Just go to your mouse settings and go to the trackball or the scroll wheel sensitivity, and you might need to put it down. Bear in mind that's a system setting, so if you like the way that the scroll wheel works in other applications, that might cause you a bit of a problem, but it's the only way that I know easily to do that. Okay, I'm just pulling up that shadow a little bit just to even up some of this stuff in the foreground. Now, back to the first point about whether we had a slight color shift. We do, and certainly it's in that sky. So if I turn the sky layer off and turn it on again, the result effectively of pulling down some of the highlights and the whites and the exposure and so on has resulted in a slightly muddy looking cloud set up here. Now we can fix that pretty easily by just adjusting the white balance. And there we go. We can also go into our color editor on this. Remember, we're only on this layer, so if I press M for mask, I can see the layer that's masked. So on our sky layer, I'm going to choose this color in the cloud, and you'll see it sits in this sort of orangey, browny, yellowy area. And I can pull down the saturation. Now, not too much, you can see it going green, but I can pull it down a little bit, and I can increase the lightness just a touch as well. So if I do a before and after, so that's with off, and that's with on, we can see that we've actually ended up with, has there been another change in there? Ah, yes, Barry's actually made another change. So he's also picked on the blues and just increased their saturation a touch, and their lightness has been pulled down to give it a bit more drama. We can do it in the color editor. I'm just going to back that off a little bit because I think the drama can come from a bit more clarity without necessarily quite so much in the saturation and pulling down the color. But then I get to a place where this just feels a bit less murky than where we were. Feels a bit more correct for a cloud. We could possibly even go a little bit brighter if we wanted to. So, you know, we could pull up that area a little bit. We could just do a little Luma range on there. But that's now down to your choice in it. Because if I go into our gradient here, we've got a very, very soft fall off. And I'd be tempted to pull this down a little more. And I'm just pressing the Option key on my keyboard. That allows me to change the profile of this mask. So in other words, have a soft fall off to here, and then very quickly fall off down here. So we don't affect the fields. And that's just going to bring that mask a bit further down so we don't get that sort of halo here as it starts, as all that darkening starts to fade out over the top of the hill. Okay, where are we? Claudius said the clouds look a little more interesting than the foreground. I'll try to crop a bit more sky. Yeah, it's one. Oh, sorry. Oh, I'd had a question still on the screen. Sorry, it's gone. It's one thing that I looked at actually. So the crop on here. What's interesting is in the original you actually had two clouds. There's this one up here and this one down here. Whereas in this crop we've sort of cut them back. And actually Barry had done 3 different crops of the same setup. I'm tempted. You know, this crop here is kind of nice. But I think we need to come up a little bit, and I'm not sure whether you need it to be panoramic. So at the moment it's 2x1. If I change this to be 2x3, I think that's going to give us potentially a little more room to play. Let's just have a look at how that comes out. You know, to me that almost feels a bit more balanced, being shifted across to the left. The problem with cropping at 2x1 on this image is these interesting bits down here, these sort of wheat sheaths, they're going to get lost if we go to 2x1 and include the sky. So let's just do that. So if we go to 2x1, and we're going to include the top part of the sky. You see here, we've lost a little bit of this field, and it's okay, but I want to see a bit more. So one option we do have is to go to 16 by 9, which is it's almost 2 by 1, but it's sort of a fake 2 by 1. It's our widescreen size for TVs. And actually, this starts to then sort of work out pretty nicely. We've got enough of the foreground here, down here, to give a little interest, a little bit of movement in those grasses and so on. But we've kept both clouds up in the sky. And to my mind, that sort of works a little bit nicer as an overall crop. Again, it's entirely down to your view on it. What I am going to do though is just do one extra layer called cloud. And in fact, before I do that, on our foreground, so this area here that's mapped in, I'm just going to adjust the white balance a little bit just to get rid of the slight green tint. You see what I've done? So it's gone towards pink away from green. So before, yes, we had the yellow, and that was coming from this sort of warming white balance here on that Kelvin scale. But the yellow also resulted in quite a green tint to some of the content of the fields. Whereas by shifting that tint a little bit along, we get to a better place. And the same thing with this gradient. So we've got a very soft fall off going up into the sky. So we've adjusted the white balance to match the field below. We've adjusted the color editor to also match the field. If I go to our color balance tool down here, you can see the midtones have been shifted into orange. But the result of that is some of that's still creeping up to the sky. So instead, what I can do is I can do a harder fall off here at the field and creep that up here onto the mountains. Now, if I want to get really specific on this, I can also add a Luma range onto here and say, well, actually, I want to discount any of the really bright stuff in the sky. You see what's happening as I pull that down? So all of the dark areas, a soft fall off up to here. I'm going to put a soft edge on it and so on. So we might miss some of this wheat down here, but the result of that is I don't get this sort of weird fall off where we've got the warming and the yellowing and everything of the ground going up into the sky a little bit as a margin, and also the cooling of the sky not coming down into the ground. So if you're going to do a split white balance or a split color tone, just make sure we've got the boundaries set correctly between the two areas you're trying to split. So back onto my cloud layer, well, this is quite simple. I'm just going to draw a little brush over these two clouds. And with my brush, I've been very rough, but actually what I can do is I can pull that down to only affect my clouds that I'm trying to really focus on. And nice soft fall off, so we don't notice that there's been too much of a mask drawn. And with those, all I'm going to do is just a little bit, tiny bit of exposure enhancement. So it's almost like turning the clouds on. So we've gone from there to there. If we don't like all of the effect on everything, well, A, we could do it with a Luma range, but B, I can choose my eraser tool, so this one on the left, and we can just erase the bits that we didn't want to affect in the sky. So I'm not going to do it at 100%, so we've got a bit of a blend, so people don't notice quite so much there's a mask that's on there. But what this allows us to do is literally turn the clouds on. They go from these grey, slightly darker set of clouds to here. And that's probably where I'd put it. So yes, you go directly from here to here. That's a very substantial change. And I think that's what Barry was looking for. But what we've done effectively is we've adjusted the color without affecting areas that shouldn't have had their color adjusted. The only thing I would be tempted to do on this shot, especially with the way this is done, this gradient here on the sky, I'm tempted to either we would use an auto mask to get rid of the field, or we could even try with our Luma range. If I just pull up, ooh, yeah, we're going to start hitting the sky. Although, actually, let's give that a go. So I'm just going to cheat basically. So here's my Luma range, which has helped me a little bit remove some of the mountains. Apply. I'm going to rasterize that mask. In other words, fix it in place. So it's no longer editable, but I'm fine with that. I'm now going to fill in. So you can do this with auto mask, but it's actually sometimes quicker to start with the Luma range and fill in the gaps. So I'm now going to fill in the bits that it didn't want. I'm going to go to my eraser, and I'm going to erase the parts that it wanted that I don't want. So along here and along here. And what this will result in is the removal of that bright band that was happening right along here. So we've still got a little bit of a halo issue that's coming from some clarity, but overall, it's a better fall off than if you see here. We've got this bright area here for quite a while where that mask was falling off beforehand. Okay, so where are we? David. So, oh, good. Okay, so you make the slow scrolling app specific. So yeah, nice and slow for Capture One and fast for everything else. Perfect. So that's cool. Carlos, we could push the yellow with the advanced color editor, creating the mask from the color selection. Yes, you could. The problem with doing that, Carlos, so what Carlos is talking about is we could effectively choose the yellow in the fields and make a mask out of that. The problem is that not all the field is yellow. Some of it is brown, some of it's green, some of it's grey, and so on. So you're not going to get a really clean mask by doing that. You might be better off with an auto mask option instead. And where are we, Francois? Yeah, so levels is an issue. A lot of people struggle with what the levels tool is actually doing, but the golden rule with it, you can use it to stretch the histogram where it's not hitting the ends of your limit, so 0 or 255. If you've got content that is in a number range above where you're moving your levels to here, it will end up being overexposed. If you've got content on the left of this range and you're moving your levels up, then that's going to be underexposed. You're not going to see anything. So the trick with levels is to try and pull it in so you're capturing as much data, stretching the data as much as you can without pushing it too far. If you're stuck, that can actually be what auto levels is for. So let me just create a clone of this variant. So on here, I'm just going to go to my background layer and levels. I can click on auto and see what Capture One does. So Capture One has then taken these lines now, as a result of the edits, into the first bit of data here, the first bit of data here, and created what it believes is right. But look at what it's done to this cloud. So this is where I say quite often to people, just be really careful with auto levels. Auto levels is a very, very mathematical way that Capture One works, and it's designed to effectively stretch the histogram as much as it can. But you might not want that. Some of the best pictures I've seen don't have any data in the very brightest parts of the image. They're quite low contrast. Just be careful with what you're doing. Okay. Alan, you have to be sorry you're late. It was me being early. Unfortunately, I had to change it yesterday. A little bit of a last minute change. Sorry. Barry. Barry's online. Cool. It's Barry's image. Cool. So yeah, it feels a bit like clinical dissection, I know, sorry. But what I'll do, Barry, is I'll send you the IP back so you can see the slight changes. Not this one. This one I'm going to get rid of. But here, and the only thing I'd be tempted to look at, Barry, on here when you get it back is removing some of this haloing stuff, which is coming from the clarity and the sharpening that you've done over that ridge. Where are we? June. I can't find the tool to adjust the horizon more level. Where is it? Okay. If you have changed this tool, so it's the straighten tool is what you're looking for, unless you're talking about keystone, but I think you're talking about straighten. So the straighten tool, press the R button and that'll do it. Or it might be that you've held your mouse down and chosen something like this, so rotate left, rotate right. When you click that, it's going to literally rotate left and right. Click and hold the mouse and you'll get back to the straighten one. The straighten one is the plus sign in the middle of the circle with the arrow, and then you just draw a line across and it will straighten the image based on where you drew the line. Okay, where are we? A silly photographic thing that no one's given much thought. There's one thing that can never be out of focus if it's in a shot. What is it? Clouds. I'm not sure I agree, David, because focus or movement, quite a lot of long exposure images will by nature not be clear and sharp on the cloud because you've got a motion trail. And actually, if I was shooting this with a quite shallow depth of field, so maybe if I was focusing on the wheat here at a really wide aperture, then potentially the clouds would be out of focus too. So it's a bit of a tough one. So yes, in theory, clouds look a little bit wrong if they're slightly out of focus. What I would say is it's slightly different, which is my biggest frustration with clouds is if you're going to move the clouds, in other words, do a long exposure and a long stream of clouds, do a long exposure and do a long stream of clouds. or keep them sharp, keep them in focus and keep them not moving. I don't like the smudgy clouds, but that's personal preference. But when I see a cloud that's, for instance, if you want to do a 20-second long water shot and the clouds weren't moving that much, what happens is the clouds sort of smudge and they just look a little bit unneat or unfinished. I want them to either be full of detail and all that texture and all that sort of stuff, or I want them to be ultra extreme moving and show me the motion in the sky. That sort of the bit in the middle where they just smudge just feels a little bit wrong. Okay, so that's Barry's. Let's go on to Sean's image. So Sean sent these two images in with a question about focus stacking. So back way before, back in let's go start of lockdown. Let's use that as a time measure. We looked at Helicon Focus with an ice block. So I'm going to go through it again today, simply because it's been quite a long time. A lot of people have been asking about focus stacking within Capture One. So the first thing to say is Capture One inside of Capture One itself does not do focus stacking. It also doesn't do HDR blending. It also doesn't do panorama stitching. So for those things, you need a plugin or a tool or an external editor. So focus stacking, for those that don't know, because there are people that don't, let me just zoom into, let's see, this tree here. So here are two shots that were probably taken at roughly the same time. In this shot on the left, this tree here is in really quite sharp focus, and these petals or whatever they are here, or leaves, are in sharp focus too. In this shot, they're not. Now at f11, normally, f11, f16, at 20mm, we'd expect things to be really quite sharp all the way through the image. But here's why. Because in the other extreme, we've got this tree here, which on our right-hand image is nice and sharp, and our left-hand image is out of focus. So we've got two different focal distances or focal lengths for the same scene, because at f11, with the closeness of this front tree, it's not possible to also have this stuff in the back also in focus. So when we get the front tree in focus, the back isn't. When we get the back in focus, the front tree isn't in focus. And what we do to join those together is something called focus stacking. So, as I say, Capture One doesn't have it built in, but there is a tool called Helicon Focus that works with it. So we're going to run through that now. So first thing to know with Helicon, remember Helicon and actually other apps. So if you're doing HDR blending or anything like that, remember that once you leave Capture One, you're into pixel-based editing. So you're into a TIFF, you're into a flattened file. So we start to become limited in what we can edit. So the golden rule with these is just make sure that everything you want to do in terms of editing is done in Capture One before you start the round trip out to an external editor. So let's have a little look at first off, lens profile loaded in, lovely. We could put on diffraction correction at f11. It might do something that's going to help us. Not too worried about sharpness fall off, because we're going to fix that with the stack. And then just from an editing point of view, because I'm going to focus on focus stacking, I'm just going to do a very quick set of changes. So I'm just going to pull up, let's just do it on the one picture first. I'm going to pull up a little bit of shadow, pull up our blacks a touch, but nowhere near as much. I'm definitely going to pull down our highlights and our whites, so we're not pushing anything out here. I might, bearing in mind what it is, push a little bit of clarity and certainly a touch of structure. So remember, clarity is changing the contrast between two boundaries of big blocks or areas, effectively. Structure is looking for texture, it's looking for finer details, it's looking for lines, it's looking for edges, it's looking for, unfortunately, also ISO noise, which is one of the downsides of it. But when we start talking about things like texture on a tree, structure is the stuff. So if I just undo this, there's without, and that's with. Structure is the stuff that makes everything more gritty. Now, if you overdo structure, you'll end up with horrible halos around things, and you'll be able to see it a mile off. But this is just about enough on this shot. So we've got these lovely textures coming into this tree here. I don't think we need to do much with saturation. It's really rich green. We could play with the sky a little bit if we wanted to, but to be honest, if I pull back whites and highlights, we're going to pull back as much as we can of that. I'm just going to check something and see if our fringing will help out here. Maybe. So purple fringing, whenever you see a high contrast line, so specifically a really dark structure and a really bright area next to it, what you can see is a magenta or a purple fringe where those two areas join. On the lens correction tab, that's what that's to fix. So that's our edit for there. Now I'm going to just right click. Oh, sorry, don't need to do that. So Command Shift C or Control Shift C on Windows to copy, and Control Shift V to paste those same edits onto the other variant, or sorry, the other image. These are two different images. I could use the copy and apply up here on the top right as well. But those are my two images. So in this image, we've got a load of stuff here in focus. In this image, we've got a load of stuff here in focus. And we want to blend these two together cleverly. So I'm going to select both of these images here. I'm just going to move my browser to the bottom so you can see this a bit clearer. Right click, and we're going to go, or you're not going to see that. It's annoying on your screen. Let me just get rid of the viewer. Right click. We're going to go edit with, and if you have Helicon Focus installed, this will appear in your Capture One menu. Okay, so we go to stack in Helicon Focus. I've got one choice here, which is to keep the processed variants. So in other words, these two raw files, the RAF files, are going to be sent into Helicon as a flattened pixel-based image. Helicon's going to do some work with us, and then it's going to send back one image back into Capture One. If I also want to keep effectively the TIFF files, the individual ones, then I tick this box here, and it will also keep those in my catalog too. But effectively, I'm going to choose a TIFF file, 16-bit, uncompressed, all the normal stuff. Not make any adjustments. We're going to carry across all the metadata and click on Edit Variants. This is going to load up Helicon. I hope. There we go. Okay, so here's Helicon Focus. It's saying two source images. Great. And I'm going to click on Render. So I'm not going to go into the huge amount of options you have in Helicon Focus. Well, we'll cover that in a second example. But in this case, I'm going to hit Render. It's done it. It's created it. That's good. And I'm going to go to Save, and I'm going to go to Save up here, Save Options. I can choose what I want to call this file. Click on Save. Now, when I come out of Helicon, so I click on the X button, just bear in mind it's going to ask me something here. In fact, you don't see it on your screen. It's going to ask me if I want to save the focus stack. Just be careful, because the focus stack is not the same as the output TIFF. So Helicon, you can also save that stack. You can save all the settings. It's a bit like the raw version of it, if you want to call it that. So you can save the stack, but it's the TIFF we want. We want to export the TIFF back into Capture One. You can see it's appeared here in my browser. So let's go back to Viewer. So I've now got my two raw files, but I've got my Helicon Focus stacked one. And on this one, if I zoom in, we now have our tree in focus and our tree in focus. So what it's done is it's blended those two together. So this here is one example. It's an example of only two images, so it's quite a limited example. So while we're at it, I figured we'll go back to the example that I pulled in back in whenever it was, March or April. So this is a block of ice in Iceland. Image number one was nice and sharp somewhere on this background. It might not even have anything back in the focal plane. Let's just have a look. So slowly, let me just zoom out so you can see a little bit clearer. So as I go along the series, slowly, you can see the camera starts getting this bit in focus. This bit is now sharp in focus. This bit is not. Sharp still up here, sharper here. This bit's starting to come into focus, bit more focus. But by the time this bit here is now nice and sharp in focus, this part is out of focus. Now this is shot at f8, so it's still a relatively small aperture. It should still have potentially more and more of the detail from the whole scene in there. But because we're so close to the object, it's not physically possible to do without going to something stupid like f22 or f64. So we've got all these shots that are all f8, and they're all together, and I don't fancy manually going through each layer and choosing the sharpest parts. So instead, now bear in mind these are 150 megapixel images, so these might take a little while, but let's have a look. So there's my images, right click, edit with, stack in Helicon Focus. Same settings, I'm not going to keep the variants, make sure that I'm on 16-bit TIFF, 300 DPI, lovely. Edit variants. So we can see Capture One's doing a little bit of work. It's going to prepare 17 images. So 1750 megapixel images might tax it a little bit. We'll see where we go. So Walter just said, yeah, so the stack effectively two different focal planes with a shallow depth of field that prevents all being in focus. So the idea is that the areas that are sharp are very, very sharp, much sharper than they'd be at a much smaller aperture. However, you can't get the whole scene in focus. So that's why we start talking about focus stacking. It's not about blending an image in that sense. It's not about putting two different images as a composite. It's about using the sharp parts of every single one of the images that you took and adding them together to make them into effectively one image which is sharp from wherever you started through to hopefully infinity, if you get it right. So we've got another minute left. As I say, these unfortunately are pretty big files, so it's going to take a little while. What it's doing, so just so you can actually understand what's going on in the background, the TIFFs that come out of the iQ4 are about 500 to 600 meg each. So whatever that is at 17 images. So we're creating about 9 gigs worth of images. Those images are going to get loaded into Helicon. So as I said earlier, the same with blending multiple exposures, the same with doing panoramic stitching. Capture One is great at doing the editing for the raw files. It's not designed to do those things at present. Who knows what's in store for the future, but as it stands right now, you need an external plugin or an external editor to do some of that stuff. There are some, there's photo merge, there's stuff that Affinity does really well. But for focus stacking, I haven't found anything better than Helicon to do it. So 10 seconds left. Let's go. And come on. Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 ish. Wasn't lying. Okay. Once it's done that, so it's now exported all those photos, it's going to load them into Helicon. So this is a much more advanced stack. We've got a lot more data in there, a lot more images in there. And you can choose your rendering method. We'll go with depth map for now. I'm just going to hit render just so that we can show you what's going on. So it's now going to think about it for a little while, as you can imagine. And you can actually see on a more complex one what it's doing. It's going into every image and it's looking for sharpness. And it's building up effectively a model of every single plane in the photo. And it's choosing the sharpest areas and putting them into one. So I can actually, within Helicon, go into retouching and say, in this area here, I actually want to take the content from this photo here. So 1138, this is my source, this is the output. And I can say, actually, I want to take that part from 1138. I want to override what Helicon said. I can show our depth map. So we can see the bit that Helicon understands to be nearer to the camera or further away from the camera. You can go into huge amounts of detail in what this does. But for now, for the purposes of this, literally all I'm doing is just going to export this. So I'm going to go to save. And I'm going to save that image. And it's going to choose where. So find, save. And remember, it's not going to export the raw. It's going to save a flat pixel-based or a flattened TIFF that's pixel-based rather than the raw data. So this is why it's really important, whether you're doing panoramic, whether you're doing exposure blending, whether you're doing focus stacking, in every single case, you need to make sure that what you've done in your edit is ready before you go to an external editor, because once this file comes back into Capture One, we are not going to be able to do the raw adjustments that we were able to do before. And somewhere, here we go, it's just loading in. Let's go back to my viewer. So I've got my browser along the bottom. I'm just going to move that back to where it was. Place right. And we now have our combined stack. So Helicon, with its default settings, let's be honest, has taken each of these individual frames, merged them together quite intelligently, and created a shot which is 100% in focus throughout, from the very, very closest details when it loads. Come on. There we go. All the way out to the furthest parts of this ice up here. And it was not possible to get all of those things in focus in one go. And that's where focus stacking comes in. So hopefully, as my freezer looks a lot worse than that, David, I can tell you. So Hopefully that makes sense in terms of how this focus stacking stuff works, but it's not something, as I say, that you can do within Capture One. You do need an external editor to do it. But if you get it right, and if a lot of cameras now are set up to do autofocus stacking, mine does. I can tell it the near distance, the far distance, and it will just go away and click, 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 and it'll calculate what I need. But if you've got the camera or the setup that does this well, and you do the processing correctly, you can end up with impossible photos of objects, which in theory would never be that sharp if they were that close. And it does allow you to do certain stuff that you might struggle with without specialist equipment. So there we go. There's your focus stacking one. Okay. Yeah, Walter, it does. So Walter's just saying Helicon Focus integrates really well with Capture One. To be honest, there are some plugins and apps that say they integrate really well and they don't. Some do. Helicon is one of the well-behaved ones in my experience. So the round tripping effect really does work. The thing that catches people out, genuinely, random alert from Apple, cool. Genuinely, the thing that catches people out is that when you go back from your editor, so Helicon or Affinity or Photoshop or whatever, and you bring it back into Capture One, remember you're bringing back a TIFF file, not the RAW. So from this point onwards, yes, I can still make certain changes. I can even try and change the white balance, but look at that change. White balance normally goes from warm to cold, right? It doesn't go from pink to blue. So just be careful. Make all your edits before you pull it back out into an external editor. Okay, Carlos would like to have them in Capture One. So Carlos, David, you can have that discussion later on. But to be honest, let me put a different view on it, and it's my view rather than any other official line from anyone else. I want my software to do a really, really good job, the best job it can, at the functions and features that it's designed to do. What I've seen over the years is more and more and more software getting bloated, and what happens is software tries to cater for very specific niches and it ends up not doing any of them very well. So Helicon have been doing the stacking stuff for years and they do it exceptionally well. Some of the merging software, the HDR merging stuff, there are tools out there that have been doing this stuff for decades who will do it infinitely better than a okay version within Capture One. And what I struggle with is when I see requests for, well, we want it to do this, we want it to have bells, we want it to have whistles, we want it to have this stuff. I would rather my raw editor did a really good job of getting the best out of my raw data and then use specialist tools to do the other stuff. Okay, so Claudia's saying he's had issues with Helicon. Rendering stacked images look like a barcode. I don't know. I'd reach out to them, to be honest, Claudia. My experience with their support has been pretty good, so I'd just reach out with them, send them the example, see what they say. Kevin, is the pixel array in Fuji RAWs have any detrimental effect in Helicon? Not that I've seen. I've played with Fuji apps. Fuji RAWs. I haven't seen any detrimental effect to come into something like Helicon, but give it a try. The other, just from memory, Helicon I think have a free trial thing. Give it a go. See what you get out. Okay, I've just got the official approval from David. There we go. So good argument. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be developing cool toys, but I'd like the toys to be based on image editing rather than some of the specialist stuff. Okay, so let's have a look at this shot. So Carlos sent this one in. And the idea was, from what you've said, Carlos, to try and make the mountain stand out. My concern, so here's our original, here's our mountain, and actually, it's a nice edit. You've managed to bring up the richness in the foreground. The mountain certainly looks a lot more vivid and detailed. If we look at the layers that you've created, so we've got our lens profile as a manufacturer profile. I'm just going to do our chromatic aberration check just on there, just to fix any unwanted stuff. But let's just have a look at your layers. So we've got in here a mountain layer. Let me turn on the mask so we can see. So there's a mask that's done really well over the mountains. There's a little bit of extra bits over here that we don't really want, but it's not too much of an issue based on what's been done in the edit. Our foreground layer. So our foreground layer has been lifted. The shadows have come up. We've got a lot more clarity in there. And then we've got a sky layer. Again, similar issue to what we had with Barry's earlier, where as a result of doing some of this stuff here, In your sky layer, you've pulled down the whites, you've pulled down the highlights a little bit, you've got rid of all the clarity and structure, and it's a good way of getting rid of some of the detail in the sky. So let's just go into here. If I turn that off, we can see, so it's been darkened, but also we've got rid of some of the, let's say, less attractive parts of the cloud. So when you get the sort of lines and squigglies and bits that are looking a bit rough, or taking down clarity and down structure results in a much smoother setup, which is great. But I can see there's a margin over these mountains, and it sort of annoys me a little bit. Maybe it's just me being picky, but let's just see what we can do, because my gut feel with this, and this is, I think, been rasterized as a layer. Yeah, so because the layer's been rasterized, I can't change this the gradient mask in there. But what I can do is just, oops, it's going to be a bit too much maybe. We can just extend a little bit into these mountains here. And again, I'm not too worried about going over these mountains. So traditionally, we'd be really worried about, being very careful over these mountain tops. Because I'm not doing any color shifting, and I'm not doing anything really that bold, I'm not worried if I go over the mountains a little bit. And we can rescue some of that with a bit of Luma range. So let's just finish up there. So I just want to make sure that this stuff's down there. Now, Luma range. Let's make sure that we're not including the darkest tips of the mountain up here. There. That's good. I'm just going to put a little bit of a soft radius on the end. Nice soft fall off. And likewise, let's just make sure we're not getting the complete bright white parts of the mountain as well. So we've used our Luma range to separate out the sky from there. Now, Carlos just said, so the snow's a concern for Luma. It is, but here's the fun thing with this. If I look at my mask, let's just apply that. The temptation is to think that we can't use Luma because the clouds are white. Well, actually, clouds aren't in here. So my cloud here, if we look at these numbers, 104, 130, or 107, 133, 183, they're pretty mid-tony, and we can see that on the orange bar on the left. Even this cloud, the bright one, 206, 202, 208, and so on. If I look at this snow here, 239, 228, 222, it's in a different league of white. So by adding that extra bit into the mask and using the Luma range to get rid of the dark parts of the mountain and rid of the light parts of the snow, we have excluded the mountain range, but it means that we don't have this halo over the top. We don't have that boundary anymore, that light area that just gives it away that we've added something on. So we're looking for stuff that makes it less obvious that we've added something over the top to enrich in that sky. Now, bringing back the focus into the mountain. So we've got our mountain area here, which again is masked really well. Up here, we might want to just tidy a little bit. We could do a bit with auto masking, but I think we're pretty good. I just want to tidy up some of this area on the sky. I don't know if you can see it on your screens, but there's just a little bit of a red tint where it sort of goes over the edge a little bit. I just want to fix that, and especially this little cloud. Okay. So our mountain done, and Carlos has already, so you've done pretty much where I would come from, which is let's put the shadows up a little bit, but add in some clarity, add in some structure. Now the interesting bit is you've done this shift here in terms of levels. Now my temptation with it would actually be to go a little bit stronger in this and add in even more contrast. And then when you've done that, you see you get this slight green sort of tint into here. Clues in the word, so tint. So let's just get that back to being less so, a little bit warmer maybe, just a touch. Okay, in my head that feels a bit better. I would be tempted to push the shadows back away from green a little bit as well, so just pull them down a touch there. So this is again with my color balance. So remember to a couple of sessions ago, color balance allows me to shift the overall color or the overall bias in shadows, midtones, and highlights into a different color range. So we can make our highlights more yellow, our shadows more blue. You can use it for split toning in terms of things like fashion shoots, but it's also handy to just shift certain elements of the picture. So if I want to change the color or the feel of the shadows to being warmer, well, I can either draw a mask over the shadows, use a Luma range, and then change the white balance, or I can just go into my color balance, go into shadows, and I can make them warmer or cooler or whatever I choose. just with this mask again, there's a bit of foggy stuff out there, but I'm going to leave that there. Now, back to bringing the focus back into the mountain. We've made this area, in my view, and again, it's personal view, a bit too bright. And the reason is here is what grabs my attention first in this scene. Now, you've already put a vignette in there, Carlos, and it's the right call in terms of bringing in this side here, but I think we need a slightly different array or different mask setup for that vignette. So instead of using this side vignette, and what you've done is just pulled down the exposure a little bit with that masked area, I'm going to use a different area for it. So I'm going to create a new layer, call it vignette pool, so a slightly different one. And I'm going to use a pretty soft brush at about 50% opacity, mostly because David's watching and he hates using opacity, but there we go. You can equally do this in flow. I just like doing it in opacity. Okay. So Carlos just said the idea is leading the way into Mont Blanc. I agree. I like the idea that there's a pathway leading up there. However, this part of the pathway here is so bright that it just, to my eye, distracts it. And again, this is all down to personal interpretation. So if you're comfortable with that as the setup, then great. Genuinely leave it as that. I'm just in a place where I do this slightly differently, which is just pulling this foreground down, and then the area here, if I don't like the fact that I've lost quite so much in here, I can always erase. So I can pull this back here. So I've still got my pathway as the brighter area. Now with that, I'm also going to pull down my highlights and my whites, because what I'm looking at is on this pathway, we've got these areas here which are pretty bright. I just want to pull those down if I can, without doing the whole area. And I'm just going to warm it up a little bit, especially to get that wood warmer. So the idea being, if we wanted to warm up the scene, which is what's happened here in the mountain, so we've added a bit of warmer sunlight, the result is that it just feels wrong if this foreground is still cool. You wouldn't typically have two completely different balances or temperatures of light in the same scene, especially not in the mountain. So that's where I'd leave it. And genuinely, there's nothing wrong with the version that you've got in terms of that vignette. So in this vignette, if I put your one on, so that's where you were. That's my slight change. And to me, this one is all about the foreground here. This one starts to be more about the background in the distance. Now, if I don't like how much we've got here, of course, we can do the same thing. So with my eraser, nice soft brush, I can brush out parts of this, but I would be tempted to leave this front a little darker than you had it. So here, and you can see when they're side by side, so both have every edit I've already done. The only difference is the one on the left is the one with the vignette that I've added over the foreground. The one on the right is the one that you had before. These two, it just feels to me this one is more about leading into the mountain than this one, which is more about this foreground here. Especially where we've got something like here, which is quite distracting. Almost to the point where I'd be tempted to just fill that in a little bit more, just to dig it or darken it down. So that's how I'd leave it. We go from there to there. As I say, the stuff that Carlos had already done in terms of mapping out those mountains, adding the clarity in there, and in fact, we can actually afford with those mountains to go a little bit more, even with a bit more structure. There's enough room in there to do that. But that just means that it just feels like it pops a little bit more, and the focus is definitely on the mountain. It's still on the road up there for sure, but it's just not making such a feature of this foreground that this becomes distracting. So I want a foreground, I want a story in the image, but I don't want it to distract from the subject, which hopefully clearly was the mountain in the background. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes. So one final one from Earl. I love this shot. Well done, Earl. So it's clear it's this shot, but he reshot it, I think, with a longer lens out into the distance of this tree. And again, the EIP. So this is the raw. This is the EIP that Earl sent in. I don't think there's much wrong with this, to be honest. I've seen Earl sent a couple of images in over the months, and I'd say this is probably one of the stronger ones in terms of edit. There's a couple of things that I'd be tempted just to do. So at the moment, there's a sky range up here, which has a Luma range on it. I'd be tempted just to pull that down just to get more of the trees leaves in there. The reason is when you've got this fall off of the tree leaves, you tend to get those halos around the edges as well. So don't be afraid to allow the mask to go a little bit over things like leaves instead. The rest of it, I mean, I'd possibly go a little stronger in this bottom one. So with our rocks here, I'd be tempted to come up here, and don't be afraid to, we can do things with our digital filters that we can't do with the camera. So I can align this graduated filter to be even stronger and turn it later on, which is different to how I'd shot it. So I'd pull down the exposure in that, and actually I could pull up a bit of clarity too. So we've now got a lot more texture and detail in this foreground. So that to me just feels a little bit stronger. Let me just clone this so we're not going over every single one of the edits. Okay, on our sky, so we've got our sky separated out here, and I'm guessing, I'm not sure, that somewhere in here in our color editor, nope, so there's no change. So I'm actually going to go into the color editor and choose our blue area, and I'm just going to pull down that lightness a touch. That's not enough for me. I actually want a bit more than that. So I'm going to add a new layer, which is sky grad, over the top of this. And I'm just going to, again, line it up. So what I'm using is that line of light, and we're actually going to use our exposure. So this exposure tab, again, the one with the histogram on the top, pull that exposure down a bit. And this just adds a bit more drama again into that shot. Now, on top of that, we've got our bottom area here. We've got our sky, which is the one that ordered in the first place, and our rocks. My temptation again, and again it's personal choice, is to create a new layer called tree, and I'm just going to do a very, very, very rough, and I mean this rough mask over this beam of light, because what I want to do is really make a bit of a feature of it by just pushing that clarity a touch more just on that light beam. Now the fun one is we can actually play with our white slider here to recover some of the detail. You see this area here is considered white. We can pull back a bit of detail into there. We can pull down our highlights as well, just to get, again, a bit of detail in. So effectively we've punched the clarity a little bit. We can expose the whole of this middle section a little bit brighter, but I'm using the HDR tools to pull down the detail in that mist, just so we see a bit more texture in there. So we go from there to there. It's a really subtle change. If I move in a little bit here, so let's go without, there, and with. You just see a few more strands of light, and that's what I'm really looking for. So effectively all we've done is we've added a bit more drama into the front rocks. We've added a bit more depth and saturation and everything into the top of the sky. We've darkened that blue down a little bit to give it a bit more richness, and we've made the tree pop in the middle. But to be honest, we're not far off your original edit, Earl. The only thing that may be a little bit distracting to my eye is this cloud out here. If I go before and after, maybe the sky is a little bit overdone up here. Let's just have a little look. So it's in this layer that we've got this slight issue. And I'm not sure where that's come from, to be honest. So let's just have a little look at our color editor. No, we're not in there. So what we've got is, maybe it's a highlight recovery thing that's done it. Yeah, it is. So in recovering the highlights, what we've got is the cloud back, great, but it's created this sort of murky sort of line in there, quite a bold line, which I'm not too keen on. So instead, let's just have a little look at what we can do with our color editor, just to bring that blue a little bit more to the foreground without overblowing this area here and getting that that quite stark bit of cloud up there. That to me just feels a touch cleaner, but you might want to play with that a little bit, Earl, just to try and recover that. So maybe a mask or something like that. But overall, really nice shot. Really like that. I like the fact that you shot this and then realized, actually this could be really cool out here. It's a really nice, as a print on a wall, so it's a really nice shot. So there we go. That's it for today. For those people that are just dialing in because they thought we were going to be at 3 today, I'm really sorry, but you can watch the last hour. So what we've run through today, split tone or split white balance across the scene. So just be careful with things like halos over and on that distance, and this edit from Barry. Focus stacking. So this image of the forest from Sean, or the example of the ice block that we created, both of them are using Helicon Focus. It's a plugin. In my experience, it's one of the better ones. You can do it manually, you can do it in Photoshop or Affinity, but personally I'd stick to a plugin. Carlos's shot here of the roadway up into the Alps, and again, it's a small change, but we just want to make sure that the subject is the subject, rather than anything distracting in the foreground. And then Earl's wonderful tree in the mist, which is really nice to start with, but we've just tweaked it a little bit more. And this foreground bit, if we've got a feature of something like rocks scream at me with structure and clarity and texture and stuff. So use them, because when it's printed, it'll really pop. Okay, so that's it. Next week will be at the normal time, I promise. I won't make that same change again, don't worry. But for those of you just joining, you can always rewind effectively. It'll be online and you can watch it again to your heart's content, or not if you don't. In the intervening period of time, obviously go on to Facebook. So the group that we've got on there, you can discuss the stuff that we covered in today's session and other stuff. And also do not forget, we have that live competition at the moment. So you can win your next version of Capture One, version 21. So either win the upgrade if you own a perpetual license, or you can win a year's worth of subscription added on to your existing subscription. You've got until the 22nd of November to submit those entries. So go to that webpage, so paulreefer.com/future of editing. You'll find the link in the comment or the description of this video as well. But please do submit your best edits, and we'll see between David and I which one is the winner for this year. And don't forget as well, on top of that, on YouTube, we've also got all of the pro tips videos, so you can look at those at your own leisure, but they'll cover specific tools, things like clarity, things like Luma ranges, things like brightness and exposure, and what they do and how to get the best out of them. Okay, so on top of all of that stuff, remember, you can send in your images, the raw files, please, if you have an EIP, so the adjusted image as well, with any comments, and send that through too. So use the upload tool, so paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. All the details are on there, but please remember to include the raw file, not a JPEG, and your name, and then we'll see what we can cover next week in that session. So until then, stay safe, stay at home if you've been told to, stay outside if you've been told to. But in the meantime, we will catch you in 7 days' time, and hope you all have a good week. Cheers, everyone. Bye.